Good afternoon, all, and welcome to the Haunted and Waiting podcast. This is Anne Lund, and today's topic, and this is podcast number 3, and topic number 3 is, do animals sense ghosts? So, with this podcast, I'm going to take it in steps. I'm going to start with the skeptic's perspective, move through some scientific insights about animal senses, and then I'm going to share some chilling anecdotes and stories of situations where animals perceive or sense spirits or ghosts. Now, remember, I will change names. I may change settings, including the animals that I will mention in the stories. This is to protect the people that have shared these stories with me, as well as the people involved in the stories and the pets themselves. I myself have owned many pets. I've had cats, I've had dogs, I've had birds, turtles, hamsters, you name it, I've had it. And I've watched them, and I've always wondered in their behavior, what is it that sometimes it seems like they see? And so that's what sparked this podcast. Let's start with the skeptic's perspective. And if you know me from my previous podcast, I have an issue with the skeptics, what we also call the materialists. These people that will not believe something because it cannot be scientifically measured. So behavioral scientists, and I found this quote online, often argue that what people interpret as paranormal reactions might simply be animals responding to subtle environmental stimuli like sounds, scents, or vibrations. So, not necessarily paranormal, but they're reacting to the senses that they have that we do not have. As a personal story, I used to think that way too. I remember as a child, I had a cat named Boots who would often look down the hallway and hiss into an empty hallway. It made no sense, but then I would watch her as her eyes followed what seemed to not be there. Sometimes she'd even dart away, with her tail up and her back scrunched. At that time, I dismissed it as something like reacting to maybe a shadow or a draft. But over time, frequency of events such as these with not only the cat, but dogs that I've had kept happening. And so if you know about my notebook, some of the stories that I've dotted in my notebook are stories such as these. And if you have a chance to go back to my previous podcast on religions, I do mention this notebook. It's basically a notebook that I jot down anything that I can explain. And if you were to do that as well, I can almost guarantee over the course of 2 years, you would have a marble notebook full of these situations, such as I. But let's go to animals and their sensory abilities. So we do know that dogs have a sense and can perceive the electromagnetic spectrum more than we can. Dogs have the heightened level to do this. They can see things that humans cannot. For instance, they can detect ultraviolet light and subtle changes in the magnetic field. Could this be what's heightened and allows them to pick on phenomena that we cannot see? As a ghost hunter, we use these EV meters to measure apparitions. And sometimes when we have an occurrence, the meter will spike. And so it's believed that spirits, or when there is a ghostly presence, it does change the electromagnetic area somewhat. And the machines can pick that up. And some people believe that possibly dogs can do that. So that could be what they're reacting to. What about the cats? Well, cats, we know, can detect subtle changes in the environment thanks to their very acute vision, and their whiskers are also sensitive to vibrations. This might be why they react to things that we don't perceive. Personally, I feel cats are a little bit more intuitive than dogs. It seems like, and I've heard this from others, and if you believe me or believe in this, I would love to hear. Please comment below or on my blog, hauntedandwaiting.blog. But cats seem to be on a different plane. It's almost as if they're seeing this world and some other world. So here are some common behaviors that I've had people tell me that I've experienced myself. Dogs sitting by the door just before their owners come home. My dog has done that. She will sit at the door 20 minutes. My husband will say, she's sitting at the door. Are you coming home? And I say, yes, I'm leaving just now. You might turn around and say that the dog knows the routine. I typically come home at 5 o'clock. However, she'll do this just as easily if I spend the whole day with friends and come home at an odd time. It seems that 20 minutes before I get home, she seems to know. Where is that coming from? And again, I've already mentioned the cats hissing or swatting at the air or staring into space for no reason. I have an interesting story. I had a dog named Max once that would just growl at the corner of the living room. And then when I looked closely, there was nothing visible, but the room felt suddenly colder than usual. And he did this, I would say, about 8 times. And the more he did it, the more I said to myself, let me focus on the temperature of the room. And that's when I noticed that it would visibly or physically feel colder. And so was it that they were sensing this temperature change? And then what was the temperature change? We do know, for those of you that maybe experience a haunting, that when there is a spirit present, a lot of times temperatures will shift. They'll get colder. You'll get a cold spot. It's similar to if you haven't experienced the cold spot, if you've ever gone swimming in the ocean or in a pool, and suddenly you swim in an area where it's warmer. That's kind of what a cold spot is, just it's colder instead of warmer, and there's really no explanation for it. So there are a lot of anecdotal experiences with animals and the paranormal. So I want to share one story of a gentleman named Lawrence Anthony. I will link this in my blog. I have mentioned again, I do have a blog called hauntedandwaiting.blog. I may also link this in my Facebook group, Haunted and Waiting, on Facebook. Feel free to join and share any stories there. But this gentleman in Africa had heard about these 9 elephants that were causing a nuisance in this little area, this little village. And no matter what the villagers did, they couldn't keep these 9 elephants out of the village. And so, unfortunately, the only solution at the time was to shoot and kill the elephants. So this gentleman, Lawrence Anthony, I suppose he had a lot of money, but he did have a refuge in Africa. He decided that he was going to rescue these 9 elephants and bring them on his refuge, which apparently was miles and miles. It was huge. And he brought them there. Apparently they were very angry and did not want to be there. I think he was even trampled once. He did survive that, but he had them for a few years and he grew really close to them. And at some point, the elephants intuitively understood that he was trying to help them. Well, how does this relate to ghosts? Well, he apparently passed away. And the day that he passed away, for some reason, that herd of elephants, which was 9, and another herd, which made 21 elephants in total, were heard approaching the house when he died. And they were grieving, and the people on the refuge were saying, well, a lot of stress calls. Elephants will make a certain sound when they're stressed. And so they heard these stress calls of the elephants. Apparently they were aware that he was dying. And then he did die. Interestingly enough, how did they know? Did he tell them that he was dying and somehow they perceived it? Who knows? But it was recorded that he died on, I believe it was March 4th, and that on his anniversary for years, these elephants would show up on his anniversary as if he were there, as if his spirit was there communicating with them. No one can explain that. I certainly can't. So it begs to differ. A lot of the information that we have are stories such as this. But let me give you a couple more stories since I know a lot of you like my anecdotes. Um, I had a dog at one point that, for some reason, would go towards my china closet in my office and start growling and barking. And if you have a dog, you know when they're barking because someone's at the door and they're excited, as opposed to when they're barking because there's danger near. And this dog was showing me body language as if something dangerous was there or something he was confused about. This was not a typical barking of a friend coming to visit. And again, he was staring at a china closet. The china closet was an interior wall. So, had the dog been barking towards an exterior wall, I might fathom that there was a deer outside, or a raccoon, or a mouse. We don't have rodents in our house. We have a cat. The cat would not allow a rodent here. We have no evidence of rodents. And this was an interior wall. So why was this dog, every time I was in the office, going in there and barking at this china closet? I couldn't figure it out. And this went on for about a week. So I ended up just oddly going on Facebook, and a friend of mine who I hadn't spoken to in years had told me that a mutual friend of ours who used to work with the two of us had passed away. Sadly, this person had committed suicide. I don't know the details. Him and I were extremely close when I worked with him. I worked with him for several years, many years ago, and we were extremely close. But when I left for maternity leave, I never went back. And then I ended up moving actually to another state, and we lost track of each other. He wasn't on Facebook, so we just kind of lost track, which happens. And my friend had told me that a week earlier he had committed suicide and he had passed away. Oddly enough, I was very devastated, very hurt about this. Oddly enough, a day or two later, I went to my china closet just because I had been paying attention to it with the dog barking at it and such. And I noticed it was very dusty in there. The shelves were glass, so the dust just showed all that more. So I decided to take everything out of the shelves and to dust. And in doing that, I came across a gold dollar, the Susan B. Anthony, or the gold dollars that were circulating around the 90s. And there was one gold dollar in there, and I held it in my hand, and I began to get very sad because this gold dollar, I recalled why I had saved it. I had saved it because this friend one day at work had approached me and said, why would they make dollars out of gold when you can sell the dollar for more than a dollar if it's made of gold? Now, you would have to know him to understand why that was funny, but it was very funny, and it was a special moment shared between him and we laughed. And when I left, I had that dollar on my desk at work, and I took it with me, and I'd always saved it as a memory of him. And lo and behold, I wondered if my dog had called me to that china closet for this dollar. Anyway, long story short, after I removed the dollar, the dog never did that again. So it ended. Another interesting story I've had when it comes to animals was one evening I was walking down my street. I live in a very suburban area, somewhat rural. Across the street is this really large house that at one point I believe was a mansion, and it's over 100 years old. And I was walking my dogs at that time. I owned 3 dogs. They were little dogs. I was walking them all together. And one of them, as I was walking by this house, which was, again, huge, easily 5 times bigger than all the other houses on the street, was pulling and barking and pulling towards that house. it was interesting because the other two dogs weren't doing that. So it was just this one dog. And her tail was wagging violently, and she looked happy, as if she was greeting someone, but there was nobody there. And the other two dogs were not doing that. So I turned to see what she was looking at, and I heard singing. I heard like a humming, to me, it sounded like a woman singing to a child, like a lullaby, and very beautiful voice. And when I looked over, I saw a woman, clear as day, three-dimensional. She had a ankle long skirt on. It was dark, or dress, I would say, but ankle long. She had dark hair pulled back in a bun or in a ponytail. It was just pulled back. And she was singing in the trees that were there. And one of the trees that was close to the road, a very big tree. And I really honestly thought nothing of it because the house was so big that there was always people there. And I thought maybe I never saw who actually lived there. So I thought maybe this was one of the people that lived in the house, didn't think much of it. And then my neighbor came out. She also had a dog who used to play with my dogs. So I was walking my dog, so she came out with her dog and she joined us. And I said to her, "Do you hear that humming? There's a lady humming there." And she looked over, and then I looked over, and I could still hear the humming, but I couldn't see the woman anymore. And my dog was still pulling, but the woman that I heard was not there. And my friend didn't hear this either. Interestingly enough, her dog was not the friendliest dog, got along with me and my dogs because they had known each other since they were puppies. But anytime there was another person around, she had to contain the dog because it was somewhat violent. And this dog was not reacting. So it was interesting that I was hearing the singing, but I didn't see her. So I kind of just ignored it and I kept walking. We're going to fast forward. It must have been weeks, months later. I don't remember. But there was a woman who lived on my street who was in her 90s. And she had been on my street for many, many years, maybe 60, 70 years. And somehow it came up in conversation about this house. And she told me that there had been a family that had lived there years ago. I believe she said it was in the 70s. And that the woman that owned the house at the time, who has since passed away, her son was in a violent car accident and was ejected from his car when he was about 16 and hit a tree and died literally right across the street from my house. And when she was recounting the story, she was explaining how sad it was that the mother came running out and had her son in her arms as he was dying. And he died in her arms. He was clearly dead. And all she could do was sing this lullaby. And she was recounting the story of how sad it was that they had to basically pull her off of her son before they called an ambulance or what have you. So interesting with that story of the four dogs involved, only one appeared to see or sense what I sensed. So makes me wonder, are some dogs just more psychic than others? I do have one more story. This one happened in the early 90s. And this one deals with, at the time, I was living in an apartment and my boyfriend had stayed over. I owned a really big dog, a German Shepherd, who was very protective. And it was middle of the night. And for some reason, my boyfriend and I were in bed. She jumped off the bed and she went into the hallway towards the door. And again, she had that stance, that defensive stance, and she started growling and barking towards the door. And within moments, my boyfriend stood up on the bed and started screaming, "Get out, get out." I looked, I saw absolutely nothing other than the dog growling and barking violently, looking towards the door down the hallway, and my boyfriend screaming, "Get out, get out." And then when I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Don't you see the guy, the bald guy?" And I saw nothing. I saw absolutely nothing. Then I ran and opened the light, and when I opened the light, he calmed down and the dog calmed down, and apparently whatever it was that they saw wasn't there anymore. Needless to say, he was very stressed out and went on to say that he did see this bald man there. The next day, I believe I was throwing out garbage. I ran into the landlady, and she lived above us. And she asked me, she said, "I heard your dog barking. Was everything okay last night?" And so I told her the story, laughing somewhat. And she turned around, and I played it off as it maybe had been a dream, that he had been dreaming. And she laughed and she said, "No, that was my husband. He comes down there from time to time because apparently they lived down there when they first bought the house. So she said he comes to visit from time to time. My granddaughter sees him." She goes, "I never see him, but other people do." And she gave me a picture and she says, "Show this to your boyfriend and see if this is him." And I don't think I need to tell you the rest of that story, but when he saw the picture, he said, "Yeah, that was him. It's a middle-aged bald guy who apparently died in the house of a heart attack in the basement where we were living." So just another story to show that maybe animals do see something. Um, I've also had a dog that reacted to a toy gun. Had never seen a toy gun in that I was aware of. And this was a smaller dog. This was a dog that we had, one of the three dogs that I was walking that night, actually. And my son at the time had brought home this toy gun. And in those days, the toy guns, I think now they have to have like an orange cap or a neon to let you know that they're not real. But at those times, you didn't need that. And so this gun looked like a legitimate handgun, and it was for a video game. And the minute he took it out, this little dog went berserk. And it became a joke around the house that you couldn't pull this gun next to this dog because the dog reacted automatically. And we couldn't understand why he would have fear of a gun. Like, what would it be about a gun that would scare him? Now, from time to time, this little dog, it wasn't the dog that wagged its tail and pulled towards my neighbor's house. This was another one of those three. Also had situations where he would stare up the stairs or look into the kitchen. Sometimes he would follow as if around the table, as if he was following somebody. And I had found out later on that the people that owned our house before we owned it, and I'm going to share another story about this family, but they were a military family, and the father, as well as one of the sons, was in the Marines. I don't think either one of them died in this house. At least nobody in the neighborhood has told me that. I know the father has since passed away. But I wonder, was my dog associating with one of these military people? It's hard to say. So, what could you say? Um, there's also, if you go on my Facebook group, I can't share the investigator's name, but there is a paranormal investigator who does ghost hunting with his dog, who apparently is psychic and helps him find spirits, believe it or not. I did reach out to him. He is one of my Facebook friends, but for whatever reason, he did not want to be interviewed. So I did not interview him. But feel free to come on my Facebook and see if you can find him. And he does post from time to time, and maybe you'll see the dog there. But let's get into some possible explanations for these animal behaviors. So ghosts and cold spots, like I mentioned, sometimes when there is a ghost present, you will feel a cold spot. The temperature will drop for a moment, and it's a noticeable drop. And it's in movies, I'm sure you've seen it. So could it be that dogs and cats sense ghosts because of this drop in temperature, and that they sense this drop more than we do? We do know that dogs and cats have more thermoreceptors in their skin. A thermoreceptor, we have them as well, and those are temperature sensitive nerve endings. they have more than we do in their noses, what have you. So it could be that they're more in tune to these subtle temperature shifts, that they sense some that we don't for this reason. There's also something called a Keschel meter. I mentioned the EV meter, which I do use for the electromagnetic charges, but the Keschel meters, I think they're used for like environmental monitoring, like whether people use them. I've never used them, but ghost hunters I know do, and it measures barometric pressure and temperature changes. Um, but it seems that animals can do this better. So for those of you that have ever lived on a farm or known a farm, we know that cows, before it's going to rain, they will sit on the floor. Cows typically don't sit on the floor, but they will do it before it's going to rain, sometimes a day before. And that's one of the ways farmers sometimes know that rain is coming. We do know that before tsunamis happen, all kinds of animals will start running towards higher ground. It's one of the things that um, in places in Japan that people will notice if the animals start running to higher ground that there could be a tsunami coming. And it's been documented that these animals seem to do this before any meters out in the ocean detect these waves or these underwater earthquakes. So the animals do have a sense about that. If you have a dog, you do know that dogs sometimes will react of a thunderstorm before a thunderstorm actually happens. I know my current dog will do that. She'll start acting really weird. One thing that she does is she automatically goes into one of the beds and gets under the covers before the storm happens. So she's sensing it. And I've heard people say that, um, to me, that they'll do that. So could it be that dogs are sensing these little changes? There is some you know, people telling stories about barometric pressure changing when a ghost is present. And then this is not for the materialist. So if you're a materialist, I don't know how you're going to take this, but there's this theory of vibrational planes. Some people believe that spirits exist on a different vibrational plane, one that's not very perceivable to humans. I know Sunset Child, if you listen to her podcast, on the Eye Opener Society. She talks about that. I know Gary, I think, believes in, multiple dimensions, I believe. And so it could be that, ghosts are on this other plane. Maybe animals have an ability to sense these different planes. Like I mentioned with the cats, it seems like cats seem to live in another dimension sometimes. They see right through you. They kind of sense a world almost that's not available to us. If you read up on quantum physics, suggests that energy and matter, it can exist in different states at the same time. So I know this is theoretical, but it could be possible that animals are attuned to these shifts of energy or a shift of dimension that we're not. You know, um, just watch like a cat's whiskers twitch sometimes, and there's nothing there to make them do that, or their eyes dilate, even though the light in the room hasn't changed. It could be that this other energy that they're sensing. I had a cat named Luna years ago that did that. She every now and then would just stare at the ceiling. Her tail would start twitching, you know, um, and then her eyes would just get so big, and then maybe sometimes I'd feel like this cold breeze. It was just a very strange thing. Okay, so that's another thing. And let's talk about their hearing. Dogs and cats can hear frequencies that are far beyond human capabilities. For example, dogs detect sounds that are anywhere from 40 hertz to 60,000 hertz, while humans can only hear 20 hertz to 20,000. That is a wide difference. That's another 40,000 hertz that they're capable of hearing. It's one reason that could explain why animals react to what seems like nothing or silence to us. They might be hearing things. I know in myself, I do a lot of recordings. We call them EVPs. So they're recordings of a ghost or a spirited area, a haunted area, that when you're there, you don't hear a single thing. But later on, when you play the recording back on the EVP, you'll hear a voice, you'll hear conversation, you'll hear music. I have these recorded. I should find a way of sharing them because I would love to. And so maybe they can do that without having to amplify the sound like we do. And there's always this possibility of this sixth sense. We know some people are better at, I believe everybody has a sense of ESP, every single buddy, but I think some people are a little bit more attuned to it. And it could be the same thing with dogs and cats. They might generally be better at it than us, and some of them better than other cats or dogs. So it's hard to say. So, let's merge science with the paranormal. If ghosts are manifestations of energy, animals might serve as natural detectors due to their heightened sensitivity to sound, smell, environmental changes. They might actually be our devices. They might actually be better than an EVP or any kind of machine that we might use. So it's just an interesting theory to think about. You know, are they actually better at it than we are? So, to recap, do animals see ghosts? Well, science really can't confirm it. They do have extra abilities, but are they extrasensory abilities? Who knows? I've shared a lot of stories. I don't know if you have any. If you do, I'd love to hear them. So please do share. Please join my Facebook group. It's just a free group. It's fun. I'm trying to keep it small. And share any stories. You can also interact with some ghost hunters or ghost enthusiasts that are there. I do have the blog. Of course, you can check the blog out, Haunted and Waiting Dog blog. I will have this transcript on that as well as some links to some of the evidence that's out there. And of course, you can always find me at my favorite venue, which is the Eye Opener Society. And you can catch that on Podbeam, as well as on YouTube. So it's been nice sharing these stories with you, and please do come visit again and check out all the other podcasts on the Eye Opener Society. Thanks again. This is Anne Lund.